You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmond Construction, the Crown Plaza Hotel and Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the law firm of Bose, McKinney, and Evans, and the Bose Public Affairs Group, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. You will find all of your tractor and needs and lifts and everything you could possibly think of at McAllister.com. Also, we're pleased to announce our podcast is now a member of the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You can find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast today. Today's a special recording about a man who, perhaps more than any other, fulfills the title of this podcast. He's a Hoosier legend. He certainly was a terrific leader. And we are speaking of former Governor Joe Kernan, who passed away just a few days ago after a battle with Alzheimer's. And on the podcast, we have Kip Tew, who all of you know and love, at least I do. Tina Noel, who worked for Governor Kernan and is one of the best PR professionals you could ever know. And the person who I think now holds the record for most appearances on the Leaders and Legends podcast, mostly because he's retired and doesn't really have anything else going on. And that is Jim Shella, who I think this is your fourth time on.
I think that's right. Great to be here.
It's great to see you, Jim. How are you, just real quick, how are you doing after your surgery?
Doing much better. Thank you. I missed, I was unable to drive for 8 weeks and I'm back on the road. So be careful.
Well, the purpose of the podcast today, what I really want to talk about is to talk to three people who knew Joe Kernan well, who are very loyal to him. And in Jim's case, Jim Shella's case, covered him both as lieutenant governor and governor, and talk about the man, his experiences, his legacy. So what I'm going to do first is ask Tina to talk just a little bit about how she met Governor Kernan, and then Kip follow, and then Jim, please follow after that. Tina, thank you very much.
Thanks, Robert, and thanks for putting this together. It's needless to say, I'm thrilled that you're spending some time honoring Joe. I met Joe technically first when I was an intern at WSBT TV in South Bend. I am sure he does not remember that because I was sent out with the photographer, did an intern interview, and we were on our way when he was a mayor. But later, when I was a television news producer, I actually, unbeknownst to me, an anchor named Mike Collins, who had a long history in the South Bend TV market for both WSBT and WNDU. Mike Collins and Joe Kernan were Notre Dame classmates. And Joe asked Mike, hey, is there anybody I should talk to who might be interested or I might like to have as my press secretary down in Indianapolis? So Joe was mayor, just newly elected lieutenant governor. And I went and, thanks to Mike, went and interviewed with Joe in his living room in South Bend. And the rest is history. I moved to Indianapolis at the start of 1997 to become Joe's press secretary and pretty much served, had the pleasure and honor of serving him for nearly the entire 8 years. He was lieutenant governor and governor, and right at the very end, joined the campaign with Kip.
Great segue, Kip.
I was trying to remember the first time I met Joe Kernan. I remember who I was with and where it was, but I don't remember whether it was the 90 campaign or the 92 campaign. I was driving Joe Hogshead, as a matter of fact. And we had a meeting with the South Bend mayor, and that was the first time I had an occasion to meet Joe Kernan. And of course, we met in a bar. And he was very impressive. And so as things happen in politics, someone had put together a dossier, if you will, maybe that's the wrong word, but a background paper on who the guy was and what his background was. And reading it on the way, I thought this is going to be a pretty impressive meeting. And he was just a regular guy in the bar, someone that was very easy to talk to. I didn't have much contact with him until '96 when he was named to be obviously Lieutenant Governor, running mate of Frank O'Bannon. And then from that point on, we became fast friends, and it's the honor of my life to be associated with Joe Kernan. He just one of the most outstanding human beings anybody could ever meet. And thank you for having me on this.
No, I'm glad you could make it, Kip. We're going to have Kip on again, and when the time's right, and he's going to sit down with, again, Jim Shella and my former boss, Murray Clark, for what I'm sure will be a rollicking conversation. Anyway, Jim, go ahead.
Well, this might surprise you. I met Joe Kernan in a bar too.
May I say real quick? I met Joe Kernan the first time in a bar.
Yeah. In my case, it was in Washington. Yeah. It was in Washington, D.C. I was out there covering an inauguration, I believe in the early 90s, and covering a group of Indiana Democrats who were there taking part, and had several people tell me, we're going to a bar called the Dubliner on Capitol Hill. And they told me I needed to come along because I'd get an opportunity to meet Joe Kernan. He was then mayor of South Bend, and everybody in that group thought he was destined for bigger things, and that as a political reporter, he was somebody I needed to meet. And turns out that all came about.
One thing that's very central to Governor Kernan's story is his time at Notre Dame. He graduated in 1968 with a degree in government, which I think is the same. Is that the same year as Michael Browning, or maybe 1 year before or after? I know we discussed this with Michael when he came on the podcast, but how important was Notre Dame and that school and that education to him, Tina? Did you get that sense from being up there?
Yes, absolutely. But when I think about Notre Dame, it isn't as much of the education as it is the lifelong friendships he formed there. And secondarily, it formed his future as mayor of South Bend. He was crucial to Notre Dame and South Bend starting to work together more to improve the city. There is no doubt. I mean, Joe was, of course, the biggest Notre Dame football fan, but I look at his legacy, if you will, as more how Notre Dame and South Bend became more unified and taking on problems within the city. Notre Dame, stepping up to the plate to volunteer more. So yeah, absolutely, great impact on his life, but the friendships are what I always remember about what his takeaway from Notre Dame was.
And the Notre Dame, alumni reach, it just has to be substantial. Are there people in Indiana or maybe Indianapolis both who Joe Kernan would reference, like, yeah, I knew him at Notre Dame, or this guy's a big Notre Dame booster, whether, I'm thinking of Michael Browning, I'm thinking of Jim Shella, and I know there's several others.
Yes. It's also a good fundraising network. Notre Dame alumni, second to only Wabash, I think, stick together in this state as far as helping each other out. So it was definitely, a network. I would say he exploited, but I don't think that's the right word. It was a network that knew him, knew his character, knew what kind of person he was, and couldn't wait to help him because they knew what an outstanding human being he was. And so saying he exploited is really kind of the wrong word in every way. But it was, Notre Dame was central to his identity. in a lot of ways. He obviously was a good Irish Catholic himself, and that school kind of personifies Irish Catholics in the United States of America. And he was just, I don't know if I've ever met a bigger sports fan in my life either. And anybody more loyal to his college alma mater when it came to football than Joe was. And of course, he played baseball there as well. And so it was central to his identity, I think, is the best way to put it.
Did any of you ever get a chance to watch a Notre Dame football game with him? And if so, what was that like?
Well, it was the IU Notre Dame football game. And I was an IU fan. So
when they played in the early 90s, right? They played a game at Notre Dame in the early 90s, I recall.
They did. And walking around tailgating with Joe Kernan at a University of Notre Dame football game was a treat in and of itself, because there wasn't anybody in the parking lot that didn't know who Joe Kernan was. And so it was just a treat to walk around with him. But I ended up having seats a little bit away from him, but I recall at halftime he wasn't very happy because the game was close. But it went the other way in the second half.
The tailgates were serious business along with Greg Downs, one of his longtime and great friends. But it was hilarious. I only went to a few, and they were great setups, lots of food, lots of drinks. But when it was time to get into that game, it was shut it down. And we are not missing kickoff. We're going in, and we're going in now. Yeah.
One of the things that makes Joe Kernan such a Hoosier legend, and as a fact, he's a member of the Indiana Veterans Hall of Fame, if memory serves, was his service in the Navy as a flight officer aboard the USS Kitty Hawk, and his time as a prisoner of war in North Vietnam. Did he talk much about that experience, either his pride of joining the military and the horrors of being a prisoner of war?
Well, if I could jump in at this point, and Tina, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I don't think he really talked publicly about his prisoner of war experience until he decided to run for governor the second time after he had become the incumbent. And he understood that experience needed to be part of the campaign. And he decided, it's my understanding, he decided to do 2 interviews to talk about it for the first time, one with me and one with Jack Colwell, who was the political writer for the South Bend Tribune. And I went up to South Bend to Joe's home and sat down with him on the anniversary of the day he was released as a prisoner of war. He took that day as a personal holiday every year. And we all know what a great guy, what a great sense of humor Joe had. That was a very solemn occasion. That is one of the more solemn interviews I've ever conducted. He had the uniform, the striped uniform that he wore as a POW. He had a tin cup that he had used a nail to carve his name in, and some other mementos that he had saved that really helped explain that circumstance. He talked about how the only thing they were fed was pumpkin soup, and he hated anything pumpkin. From then on, you couldn't get him to eat pumpkin pie. That was an interview that was very
By
unusual.
the way, Jim.
Yeah.
By the way, the pumpkin soup wasn't what you might consider pumpkin soup. It was tepid water with slices of pumpkin in it. That's how he described it to me.
And ants floating in it. Yeah.
Yeah.
For 11 months.
But the other thing that made that interview unusual was there was no staff there. It was a news photographer and him and me, and it was a very personal conversation about his experience.
And if I can also interject this, he didn't really want to do it. I mean, he never wanted to exploit it. He was embarrassed that and pushed back for years about it being something, the rest of us were like, Joe, this is an incredibly moving piece of your history. It helps define the kind of person that you are. And he just didn't want, as most people that are comfortable in their own skin as he was, who know who they are, didn't need to brag about it, didn't need to highlight it, didn't want to exploit it. I would tell you it was people like me that kind of forced him him to do it, and said we need people to know who you are, like we know who you are.
And when we talk about 2004, I definitely bring that up. Kip, please tell me if I'm wrong. You were Indiana State Democratic Party chairman in 2004 when Kernan ran against Mitch Daniels. Okay. Was based on the chronology that I researched, Joe Kernan was at the Hanoi Hilton at the same time as John McCain.
Yes.
Did they know each other very well afterward? Did they ever talk about that sort of thing? Or another person would be James Stockdale, who was kind of an answer to a trivia question in the sense that he was Ross Perot's running mate in '92, but he also received the Congressional Medal of Honor for his time in military service. But was there any sort of connection there at all between McCain and Kernan?
I'm pretty sure they met is all, Robert. I don't think it was more than that. You probably remember that after his time in the governor's office, he, though did an ad supportive when President Trump was critical of John McCain being captured. That was one of the few times he stepped out into politics again after the governor's office, because he felt so strongly that the words that President Trump used to describe prisoners of war were horrible. And again, it takes a lot for him to come out and get into the political fray, but he was supportive, of course, of John McCain.
And my recollection of the Hanoi Hilton, from what I can remember and learn, you got to know maybe your roommates, and you didn't get a lot of outdoor recreation time to meet a bunch of other folks.
And for those of you who don't know, he spent 11 months. Joe Kernan spent 11 months in North Vietnam. He received the Navy Commendation Medal, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Distinguished Flying Cross. How much do you think that his service in the military and, the POW experienced influenced his decision later on to go into public service? Kip?
Well, I know I said earlier that central to his life was his, being a Notre Dame person. I think probably more central to his life was he I think, figured out pretty early on in his life that the purpose of his life was to serve others. And he, I think, figured out a way to do that by being first the city controller and then the mayor of the city of South Bend and then lieutenant governor and governor. And, some people look at politicians and think, well, they're just ambitious and they're serving their own interests, and you can never ascribe to politicians positive motives about wanting to help other people. But it's been my experience that the majority of politicians actually at least start out in this business wanting to help other folks. And then some of them lose their way. But I can tell you, Joe never lost his way. His entire life was about trying to make the world a little bit better place.
Part of his legacy is the fact that he was a reluctant statewide office holder. Bob Kovach, the former mayor of Mishawaka, was on the committee to find a running mate for Frank O'Bannon. And it was quite a sales job, as I understand it. Kovach told me how the deal was sealed, again, believe it or not, in a bar. You got O'Bannon and Kernan together at Lockmiller's Pub across from the state capitol. And it took some convincing to get Joe to become Frank O'Bannon's running mate. And we all know that he dropped out of the governor's race before he ascended to the governorship, and then decided to get back into it. So I think public service was certainly part of his makeup, but he did not have the ambition that other politicians have.
Yeah, he was happiest as mayor of South Bend. And I'll build on what Jim was saying about the whole convincing story. But it was, I bet if anyone else other than Frank O'Bannon asked, I don't think he would have done it. I mean, that was his admiration and respect for Frank O'Bannon that pushed him over the edge to want to be his running mate.
Did they develop a friendship while Frank O'Bannon was lieutenant governor, or how did they know each other?
Yes. I mean, yes, when Frank was lieutenant governor, and I think they got to know each other during the vetting process for his running mate. But I would amend by saying my recollection, conversations I had with him, he actually loved being a lieutenant governor. He enjoyed that immensely as well. I think the year he was governor was not an enjoyable experience in large measure, and it was because of externalities. Not had he gotten a full term as governor, I think he would have enjoyed it much more. But he was thrust into a situation where he had to work with the staff that wasn't his right away. He had to transition that staff to a new staff. He had to put together a campaign staff, make the decision to run because he had already made the decision not to run. He had to quell the infighting inside the Democratic Party because of the primary that he was trying to conclude. All of those things, plus having to be the governor and having to run a campaign, made his year and 4 months as governor pretty difficult for him. And I don't think he looked back on that with a lot of joy, but I think he really loved being a lieutenant governor. I think he in fact, I don't know, Tina, I don't want to argue with you, but I think he actually enjoyed lieutenant governor more than being mayor because it wasn't as intense. As he told me one time when I was thinking about running for mayor of Indianapolis, he goes, Kip, one piece of advice I have for you is when somebody's toilet backs up, they think it's the mayor's problem. You got to be ready at all times of the day to respond to constituents. And it's a pretty all-consuming job. Whereas lieutenant governor's job wasn't as all-consuming. He did have more time to have fun as lieutenant governor.
I think that's fair. Yeah, no, that's fair. But I also think, and it builds on two things you were saying, being mayor, he was able to fix things himself.
Yes.
And it was very hands-on and you felt like you could make a difference more quickly in people's lives. And I think you're right. That was the year of being governor was difficult because he wanted to be governor. He wanted to do the things that would make people's lives better, but he was also running for governor at the same time. So I think you're right. He would have loved being governor because he felt he could make a difference.
Do you think he enjoyed being mayor? He was elected in 87, 91, and 95. In the late 80s and early 90s were halcyon days for the Notre Dame football program. Do you think that played any factor in that he was just down the street and didn't have to drive all the way from Indianapolis?
Probably.
Well, I think reading the stories about him this week, one of the things that really struck me is that when he was first elected mayor, he won a little over 50% of the vote. When he ran for a second term, I think he won over 70%. When he ran for a third term, he won over 80%. I think the folks of South Bend enjoyed having him as their mayor as much as he enjoyed doing the job.
No doubt. And I can't tell you, Robert, the number of times I've had random people come up to me over the years, even when he was lieutenant governor and saying, I saw Joe Kernan on the street picking up trash. And he did it when he was mayor. He did it when he was lieutenant governor, and he did it when he was governor. If he saw a piece of trash on the ground flying around, he would race to get it and put it in a trash bin. And that kind of stuff kind of adds up over the years. You're a 3-term mayor of the city of South Bend, even though you don't want attention for it and you don't do anything to get attention for it. People see you and they see what you do.
Yeah.
Yeah. He wouldn't talk about it. He never talked about it to me. I'd hear it from other people.
Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guests today are Tina Noel, Kipper V2, my friend, and Jim Shella, who has been on the podcast more than once, retired political reporter for Channel 8, our current podcast partner. Our topic today is the life and legacy of a phenomenal Hoosier, and that is Governor Joe Kernan, who passed away just a few days ago. Is there, or can you relate, was there a particular Hoosier leader or legend whom Joe Kernan particularly admired?
I think Birch Bayh comes to mind pretty quickly. They had a good relationship. I think he respected Birch enormously. Frank O'Bannon would be another one that he admired. Obviously, agreed to be his lieutenant governor. Those two come to mind. There were probably some other people from South Bend. John Bradamus, I would guess, although he didn't talk a lot about John Bradamus. I think he's somebody that he had enormous respect for as well. Tina, you might be able to shed some light there.
Kip, that's a tricky one for me. So I go with what you're saying.
How about if I throw out the name Maggie Kernan? Is that a Hoosier leader or legend who Governor Kernan particularly admired? They're a great love story.
Yes. Yeah.
I
Tina,
can't even.
I don't know if I can get through it.
Yeah, I don't.
Let me tell you one story. When he became governor, he was conducting news conferences on almost a daily basis. He was in the Indianapolis media all the time, and if you were a reporter from Indianapolis, you got an opportunity to get all your questions answered. But he chose not to do any sit-down one-on-one interviews until he went back to South Bend, and I think it was 2 or 3 weeks after he took office. He went up there and he talked to the South Bend media one-on-one first. Those of us from Indianapolis who came up also got a chance to talk to him one-on-one, but we had to go up there to do it. So the news photographer I worked with in those days, Jim Hester, and I got up to South Bend early and went and got lunch downtown South Bend at a Chinese restaurant. And we walk into the foyer of this restaurant, and there's a large photograph there of Joe and Maggie Kernan sitting in a booth surrounded by beer bottles. And when I got my chance to interview the governor, I sat down in front of him and I made a comment about the restaurant and this photograph and said something about his beer bottle collection. And he didn't miss a beat. He said, "Oh, those are all Maggie's."
Did she deny it?
She wasn't there. She wasn't there to defend herself.
Jim, you covered the 1996 campaign. The Republicans had controlled the governor's office for 16 straight years. In 1988, a young upstart, if we may call him that, named Evan Bayh, upset John Mutz, a former podcast guest here at Leaders and Legends, and really changed the fortunes of the Indiana Democratic Party. Evan Bayh's running mate was Frank O'Bannon. In 1996, Frank O'Bannon runs against very popular Indianapolis Mayor Stephen Goldsmith. Jim, talk a little bit, please, about your remembrance of that campaign, and were you surprised at the result?
When Frank O'Bannon beat Steve Goldsmith, I was not. Wish TV had done some polling late in the race that showed Frank O'Bannon with a lead, and that's the only election I remember where we purchased exit polling, and our exit polling mid-afternoon on election day matched our polling from the previous week, and so I went live from the Goldsmith headquarters that night right after the polls closed, and I said Frank O'Bannon's going to win tonight, and the Goldsmith campaign staff came out with their hair on fire. They obviously didn't think they were going to lose. No, I was not surprised. I was not surprised.
In
Kip,
August, you wouldn't have predicted it, though, would you have?
Kip, I was just going to ask you that.
That's probably right. That's probably right.
Yeah. That campaign, of course, is one of my all-time statewide favorites because Frank O'Bannon came in as the heavy underdog, incumbent mayor of Indianapolis. I don't know how popular he was, but he was sort of powerful would be more how I would say, rather than popular. I don't think he was even popular among the Republican Party in some corners like he had a primary against a certain former state chair, as a matter of fact, if I recall correctly. But we got a couple of breaks in that '96 campaign for sure. There was a police brawl after an Indianapolis Indians game that the mayor of Indianapolis didn't handle particularly well, and they also screwed up mightily on a TV ad back when there was some degree of the media holding people's feet to the fire if they put out dishonest ads back then. And Goldsmith's research guy had messed up mightily, and they put Frank O'Bannon down for voting for a tax increase that he in fact did not vote for because they got the number wrong, the bill number wrong. And so we had a great time with forcing them to take the ad down because it was false and misleading. And those two things, I think, helped us a lot. But Frank, Frank's ads also were fantastic television ads, some of the best that have ever been produced in the state of Indiana, in my judgment. And Frank was very disciplined. Tom New was his campaign manager. Tom was very, very disciplined. He was a fantastic campaign manager. And he kept the ball rolling on that. And I think it was an upset. It wasn't an upset election day. I agree with Jim. We got a lead sometime in September, and I don't think we ever relinquished it. It might have been a little later in September, but we never relinquished the lead. It was always pretty close, but it was a great campaign without a doubt.
Well, and for what it's worth, when you talk about expectations leading up to Election Day, you'll remember Goldsmith had a pollster who told him he was ahead, and it was a headline later that Goldsmith got his money back from that pollster.
We should have got our money back in 2004 from our pollster.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Yeah.
Let me ask you a question. Was Joe Kernan? Go ahead.
Well, one of the things I wanted to make sure we mentioned today is that at the end of that election, on Inauguration Day, I know you got to remember Inauguration Day. Frank O'Bannon decided to do the first outdoor inauguration in Indianapolis, and the high temperature that day was something like -1, right? And the one line that everybody remembers from that is when Joe Kernan got an opportunity to speak. He went up to the microphone and said, "We have picnics on days like this in South Bend."
Yep.
Which is a classic Kernan line. He mentioned his hometown and got a laugh and kind of brought up what everybody was thinking about, which was how much they were shivering.
Well, the one I was going to ask about '96 and Kernan was Mayor Kernan Frank O'Bannon's first choice, or was there other people who they kind of went through and they had a bigger process?
I think he was his first choice. I think he turned it down a couple of times and they kept coming back to him, actually.
And was it sort of a regional thing? I mean, O'Bannon's from Southern Indiana, and now you have someone, regional balance is always this big deal in Indiana gubernatorial politics.
There was definitely a plus, but I think it was a character thing. I think it was also somebody that Frank O'Bannon thought could step in his shoes, someone who could be a successor, someone that he wanted to see as the future of the Democratic Party, someone he wanted to see as replace him as governor, somebody that had high character, high ability, and he picked him for all those reasons, and he was right on every single score.
Tina, we were talking about Joe Kernan's love of being mayor, love of being lieutenant governor. If he was here and he was on the Leaders and Legends podcast, an opportunity that I wish I would have had, of course, what do you think he would say were his biggest accomplishments as lieutenant governor?
Well,
winning the softball tournament, right?
Yeah, which I had to be reminded of.
Well, he had a significant portfolio as lieutenant governor, and I think that gave him an opportunity.
He did, and a lot of that was, you start with your normal roles of the Department of Commerce, head of agriculture, president of the state Senate, but Frank O'Bannon trusted him to take on other important tasks. One of them was working with the Department of Veterans Affairs. He literally, obviously, because of his service, he said, I want you to take care of this. I want you to look into the department, look at it, see what we can do better, see how we can serve veterans better. That wasn't a traditional lieutenant governor role. Tax reform was something that Frank O'Bannon tasked Governor Kernan with. And he did not take that lightly, as you might imagine. And in true Joe Kernan form, he sought out the best and the brightest minds, bipartisan minds, to work with him to develop a solution to the property tax issues we were having at the time.
And income taxes as well. I mean, it was a complete overhaul.
It was a tax reform, not property tax only. You're right.
And did he consider himself, did Lieutenant Governor Kernan consider himself kind of a friend of the mayors in the state house sort of role? I mean, mayors tend to stick together because they've dealt with so many of the same problems. So here he is as lieutenant governor. He's in the state house. Did he want mayors of bigger cities or any cities or towns to be able to talk to him and he understood what their problems and concerns were?
You don't be a three-term mayor. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Tina.
No, I was going to say, I think for sure. But I'm trying to picture, when we're talking specific examples of that happening, but I am sure he did. He obviously understood what those communities were going through.
My big memory of the tax reform fight was that it failed in the House by 1, 2, maybe 3 votes. I have to go back and look. And one person reversed so they could bring it back up because that's the rules in the House to be able to do it. I think it failed the first time for lack of a constitutional majority. Maybe Jim remembers this better than I do, but a couple hours passed, maybe 3 or 4 hours passed. I was on the commission, and part of my job on the commission was try to help get the votes to pass the thing. And I remember going to Matt Whetstone, who was in the legislature at the time, and a couple other people, and lobbying them hard. And a couple hours later, the vote went back up on the board and passed it. It needed bipartisan support, and it got just enough.
Could I share something real fast? And this is a personal story,
Please.
and it's tied to tax reform. Obviously, messaging was important, and we had worked on this for a long time, getting ready to roll it out. Going to, set up visits around the state to explain why this is important, why it needed to pass. And it could have been a year we were working on it. I'm not sure if anyone remembers, but at some point it was 2001 because it was September 11th. And that delayed us a little further from this rollout of this tax reform plan. And the rollout got pushed to a point where I had plane tickets to Las Vegas. The person who was supposed to be intimately involved in this rollout was now planning to go to Las Vegas. And not only that, going with one of my very best friends, because I met her through Joe, Megan Garber. We were both, along with probably some other people who were working in the State House, we had tickets to Vegas. And
Was that the Euchre Club, Tina?
It was probably Euchre Club people.
Yeah.
Robin, your wife, was probably involved. But Joe insisted, number one, that we go. He would not have any part of us not going to Vegas. And to this day, I'll never forget, while we came up from the pool in Vegas, and Joe Kernan, it passed while we were, or I'm sorry, I think it passed. It must not have been the rollout, or I can't remember. Either one, passed or rollout. Either way, it was a big deal. And he left us a message saying, "Thanks so much for all your hard work. I'm so happy you're in Vegas." He cared about other people so much more than most people.
We all thought on this side of the aisle, the Republican side of the aisle, was actually working for State Auditor Connie Noss at the time, that Joe Kernan was a slam dunk 2004 Democratic Party gubernatorial nominee. And yet he somewhat shocked the political class and maybe surprised a few people when he announced he was not going to run to succeed Frank O'Bannon. And to Kip's point he made a few minutes ago, where Governor O'Bannon thought that Kernan would be a natural successor and a victorious successor. Jim, I got to go to you first. When Joe Kernan made the announcement he was not going to run in 2004 for governor, how did you cover it, and what do you remember about it?
It ruined my day.
And Tina's.
Oh,
and Kip's.
not your own, not just you, bro.
Well, yeah, mine for a different reason, probably. It was a Sunday night. I have a clear memory. It was a Sunday night, and for some reason, the Wish TV Christmas party had been moved to a Sunday that year. And I was at a Christmas party when I got the first inkling of it, and it's like, I gotta go. We're going home, and gotta work the phone. And it was an absolute shocker, a complete surprise.
Kip, have you recovered?
I'll never forget where I was when he called me. I was watching the Colts in my basement man room. He called me to tell me he wasn't going to do it. And I was very deeply disappointed. Short of the night he lost, probably one of the most disappointing moments that I've experienced in politics. But, he made the decision for reasons that he didn't need to be governor. It wasn't that he thought he was going to lose, because it was before Mitch Daniels had even really thought about running. And I don't think, had Joe Kernan said he was in it, I don't think Mitch Daniels would have run against him. I don't think Mitch would have been persuaded to come back and try to run against Joe Kernan. It would have been a much different situation all the way around. But Joe, as I said, I think to start it off, he was comfortable in his own skin. He knew who he was. He didn't need the title of governor to define him as a human being. He knew how much work it was going to be. He knew it was an 8-year commitment. He knew that he wanted to spend some of his life enjoying his life. And some of the things that he anticipated that were going to be troubles when he actually did take the job and do it were exactly as he thought they were going to be. And that was our party was divided. One of the things that frustrated him more than anything was people who weren't team players, who didn't look at the ultimate goal, but were more interested in themselves and their own advancement, and not being a cog in the team. And he saw a whole bunch of that at the end of Governor O'Bannon's term, and I think he said, you know what, I don't need this. This is not something I need to do.
Kip, let me ask you a quick question. Go ahead, finish, and I want to ask you a question about that. Go ahead.
In the end, after he became governor, and there was a bitter fight, I think there was a certain there was never a more competitive guy on the planet, but there's also nobody with more sense of obligation. And I think those two things combined in December is when he decided. I don't remember exactly when he decided to run again. I think it was November. It was right after the November election and the mayoral elections. And he decided to get in. I think it was out of sense of obligation and in a sense of competitiveness, both, that he got back in.
Well, let me ask you a quick question, and then I want to get Tina's thoughts. You mentioned just a few minutes ago, and I say this only because it would seem somewhat counterintuitive. In the early 2000s, the Democrats are riding high in Indiana. Governor, I think you had the House because John Gregg was Speaker. You had the mayor of Indianapolis. You had Evan Bayh in the United States Senate. So you mentioned that the Democrats were divided, and I wouldn't expect you to go into great detail, but what were they divided about? And did Joe Kernan just go like, look, I want to be governor, and I don't want to sit there and have to quote unquote babysit people who aren't going to be on Team Kernan?
Well, just like anything, and I'm sure this is the case right now in the Indiana Republican Party, where they have so much control. Once you have control, you have people that are jockeying and angling for positions and trying to be the big dog and trying to, there's a lot of ambition, as I said before. I'm not naming names, but the divisions were you guys on the other side probably had no idea or had just a small inkling about them. But there you had, rival staffs, and and those types of things. And Joe Kernan wasn't about that. He didn't have any time for any of that kind of stuff. He didn't ever want to hear about it. He didn't want people not getting along. He did not enjoy people not swimming on, not using the oar to all go in the same direction. Is that fair, Tina?
That's fair, but you Kip, you definitely know more about the inner workings and the infighting. I mean, that was something. Yeah, I could see. Yeah, you're only as good as your.
What are your thoughts, or what are your memories of getting the call or the meeting where he says, "Look, I've decided I just don't want to be governor, and I'm not going to run in 2004." Did you have that? Was that message delivered to you personally? Was it a phone call, or did you learn when everyone else learned? When Jim Shella told you?
No, I got called into the lieutenant governor's office to sit down one-on-one, and he told me what he had decided. And I was upset, obviously, but I was more sad for the state of Indiana. I in that moment, that's what I thought, that we're about to lose the chance at an incredible person leading the state. But at the same time, and something I wanted to share earlier, about Maggie, there was a positive. He got to see Maggie more than, and what I wanted to say earlier was that, we scheduled life around him getting home to South Bend to see Maggie. She still had an executive marketing job in South Bend, and she was still in South Bend for the most of the time we were in the lieutenant governor's office. So we scheduled his life around, you're going to get to see Maggie as much as you can. So I was happy for him in that regard, but sad for the state.
And I don't want to leave the wrong impression. I don't think it's the main reason he didn't run, the infighting. It was one of those straws that kind of was like, he had, 10 reasons to run and 15 reasons not to. And it was one of the 15 reasons not to.
Well,
it wasn't the first one.
Indiana's not a very big state until you have to drive it from one end to the other. Then all of a sudden it becomes Texas. And that's one of the things that when you talk to people who decline to run statewide, it's, well, yeah, we're not very big, but try going from Fort Wayne to Evansville to Richmond to, Terre Haute all in 1 or 2 days.
Absolutely.
I will say this for him, though. He got around faster than most.
Jim Shella, his announcement not to run, what did that mean to you as a reporter for the 2004 race? I think Kip's got the chronology right. I don't know that Mitch Daniels had gotten in. I know he was being courted. I think he was being courted about the time that Joe Kernan made his announcement that he wasn't going to run. I think that's 2002. And but Jim, from a reporter standpoint, are you thinking, oh my, now 2004 is going to be a completely different story because we don't have the 800-pound incumbent gorilla for the D's?
Well, and suddenly we had a couple of Democrats running. So we had there was the prospect for a primary on the horizon. It's if you're a political reporter, it's opportunity. Things are nothing's predictable, which it means there's a good reason why you've got a job. You got things to figure out. But it's not, I never get invested in who's in the race or who isn't. It's just my job to try to figure out what's going on and inform the public. I will say that once, if I can skip ahead, once he got back in it, and it was Mitch Daniels against Joe Kernan, I have covered several governor's races that were closer than that one, but I don't know that I've covered one that was more hard fought. Though when you talk about Joe Kernan being competitive, Mitch Daniels is as competitive. And I always remember I was a panelist on a debate, the last of the gubernatorial debates, and it was at IU Southeast in New Albany. And you could cut the tension in that room with a knife. Those two guys were both in it to win, and everybody who was around them was in it to win. And there was very little humor that night. It was serious business.
Well, let's very quickly, thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guests today are Tina Noel, Kip Tew, and Jim Shella. We are talking about the life, career, and legacy of true Hoosier legend Joe Kernan, who passed away just a few days ago. Frank O'Bannon dies on September 13th, 2003. Do you remember that day, everyone? I'm sure you do. Please talk about how Joe Kernan handled that day and the next few days until he appoints, because I want to make sure we get this in, he appoints Kathy Davis as Indiana's first female lieutenant governor. Kathy Davis was a previous guest on the Leaders and Legends podcast. She was terrific. She had a great story about how that happened. Tina, maybe let's go to you first. You were working for him. What was that day like?
So the little blip in my history with Joe is that after he announced he wasn't going to run, I was starting to think about other jobs since I planned to work for him as long as he would have me. But somebody I applied for a job at Eli Lilly, and I technically worked for 5 months for Eli Lilly out of the 8 years Joe was in office, one way or the other. So I actually learned of Governor O'Bannon's passing sitting in a cubicle in the communications department at Eli Lilly. And somebody else was working in the lieutenant governor's office on comms at the time. So I heard it from a new colleague. But I don't want to go out of order because obviously that was a shock and a tragedy. I know, and Kip, you might cover some of this too, but one of the things that I hope that the O'Bannon folks take away is that when Governor O'Bannon, a positive at a minimum, is that Joe was there with Governor O'Bannon when he had his stroke in Chicago at a conference. And it was Joe who, and one of our colleagues in the Lieutenant Governor's staff, Tom McKenna, who insisted on, this isn't right. Frank O'Bannon's always on time. Something's wrong. And so the hotel staff went up to find out what was going on. So it makes my heart a little happy to know that Frank O'Bannon had Joe Kernan with him when he was in very bad shape.
Kip?
Well, obviously, I was at work the day Governor O'Bannon was stricken with a stroke, and we knew pretty quickly that it was very, very serious, and that it was likely that Joe was going to step in. So I wasn't surprised on the day that the call came. I think it was a Saturday, or was it? Oh, it was a Sunday. Was it a Saturday or Sunday? I think it was a Saturday.
It was a Saturday.
Yeah, it was a Saturday. I was actually running for city county council, and I was out knocking on doors. I remember the neighborhood I was in when I got the call, and my wife Robin was with me. We were on opposite sides of the street, and she had worked for Governor O'Bannon, and we got the call, and we stopped what we were doing, and a couple hours later, or maybe an hour later, we were summoned to the State House for a swearing-in ceremony. That's my recollection. It may not be that good, but I remember being in the Supreme Court chamber for the swearing in, and I think it was a couple hours later. Jim, maybe you remember it better than I do. It was a whirlwind for me.
Well, yeah, it was a Saturday. I was at the grocery store, and I got a call saying that we'd gotten word that the state police were getting the O'Bannon family together, and so I ran home and got ready for work, and went straight to the State House, and they'd announced that he had died by the time I got there. And I started, doing, I think 8 or 10 hours worth of television at that point. Really this may sound odd, but it was a pleasure to be there for the swearing in that took place in the Supreme Court chamber, because it was so historic. Nothing like this has ever happened before, and with any luck, it won't happen in the future. But Ted Boehm, state Supreme Court justice, swore in Joe Kernan as governor, and they had met what is backstage at the state Supreme Court, and Ted Boehm had taken a piece of paper and basically sketched out the choreography. You go here. It looked like, somebody designing a basketball play or something. You go here, I'll go here. We do this, and one of the things I did was after the inauguration was complete, I asked if I could have that piece of paper so I could show it to the TV audience, and they let me have it for just long enough to do that, and then took it back because I believe it went to the state Supreme Court archives.
Kathy Davis was then nominated and confirmed as lieutenant governor, first time in Indiana history. Tina, what did you feel about that? And what is it about Joe Kernan who wanted to make that sort of history?
Before I joined you today, I was looking back also at something that Joe wrote. He was the commencement address. He gave the commencement address for Notre Dame at one point. And
there's a backstory to that too, but go ahead, Tina.
Well, that he always chose, I'm going to get upset, but he always chose to do the right thing when he had the opportunity. So Kathy's an example of that. Of course, it's outstanding that she was the first woman lieutenant governor, but she's brilliant. And it was just such a great choice. But I reflect on that commencement address because it's among the many choices. When he gave that commencement address, he chose that moment. He gave some great and poignant advice, but he also chose that moment to talk about racism and prejudice to this young, impressionable class of Notre Dame graduates. So Kathy is just one of the many times when he chose to do the right thing, and she was just extraordinary. It doesn't, it was so fun, and I remember that he chose her, and then we knew it was going to happen. And I didn't know Kathy from Adam. He did. He was impressed by her from the get-go. She had been part of the 21st Century Research and Technology Fund, which invested in startups. She had been with FSSA, but I met her that night and I just thought, oh my God, these two so brilliant people are here. And Joe is saying to me, okay, we got to prep Kathy for the announcement. And I was like, oh my gosh. And that is, again, he just trusted you. He just trusted you. He made you feel good and confident and smart. And when he said you can, he's implying you can do this, Tina, without even saying it, that you can prep this woman who is just, heads above everybody else when it comes to smarts. So it was a great choice, but one of many when he just did the right thing when given the opportunity.
Kip, do you want to give up the backstory to the Notre Dame speech?
There were people at the University of Notre Dame who didn't think Joe Kernan was a big enough star to be the commencement speaker. It's one of those things that I'll never get over because
me neither.
I think he's probably one of the greatest commencement speakers that ever spoke at the University of Notre Dame.
He was governor at the time? He was governor at the time or lieutenant governor? He was governor?
No, he wasn't governor yet. I don't think he was
governor yet.
I think he was lieutenant governor.
I think he was lieutenant governor. So yeah, not big enough for Notre Dame. But I want to say a personal story a little bit about Kathy Davis. I remember he had a condo downtown, and I think it was the Glove Factory or one of those before downtown exploded in condominiums, and lieutenant governors had to find housing themselves when they're lieutenant governor. They don't get a residence. But so he had this fairly small condo, and we were there prepping for the announcement of who was going to be his lieutenant governor candidate. And I was helping vet the speech, and we're going through the speech, and I didn't know who it was. And the speech had her name in it. And I thought it was just a placeholder because I didn't know who Kathy Davis was. And I'm going through the speech, and I'm like, well, are you guys going to tell me who it is? And they go, it's right there on paper. I said, well, who's Kathy Davis? And it ended up being fantastic, as it was. But it was it's a small story. He did pluck her out of obscurity, at least in the political world. Obviously, I was deeply involved in the political process in the state of Indiana, and I didn't know who the woman was that he picked to be lieutenant governor. So
I think she was a city controller for Bart Peterson at the time.
Yeah. And then I remembered, but when I first read it, I was like, who the hell is this? Right? I thought it was going to be a state senator or a mayor or something like that. So yes.
Yeah. To call Kathy Davis a rock star is probably understating it. Her resume and personality and kindness, they all speak for themselves. But Joe Kernan then decides to run for governor. And by this time, I think Mitch Daniels is in the race.
Yes.
Jim, what was it like when you got that news? And then Kip, I want to ask you, because I think you would be state party chairman at the time, or just about to be. But Jim, go ahead.
Well, that's big news, of course. And it led to all sorts of other stories. I mean, Joe Andrew had put together a campaign for governor, and had named Brent Simon to be his running mate, that was a pretty big story. And all of a sudden, that's something that has to go away. And there were a lot of developments there. It was a great time to be a political reporter. There was an awful lot of news taking place on both sides.
Well, and Vi Simpson, you can't not mention
Right.
Vi, who was the primary opponent to Joe Andrew
Right.
at the time.
Right.
But Kip, let me ask you: was running? You talked a few minutes ago. Everyone kind of did about Kernan basically kind of having to be talked into running as Frank O'Bannon's lieutenant governor. Did Governor Kernan have to be talked into running for a full term in 2004, and for what he knew was going to have to be a very tough race against Mitch Daniels?
Well, I was not part of the discussions to try to talk him into it that I recall. He sought my advice as to if he were to make the decision to get in, how was it going to impact the primary that was in the middle of happening. And both Vi Simpson and Joe Andrew were friends of mine. It was one of the more difficult times in Indiana politics for me personally, when you have to choose between people you really admire and want to help. It's always hard. But there were lots of people who were concerned about how that primary was unfolding. And you had an incumbent governor now who was, there. It was a very awkward, I guess is the best word I can use, awkward time to try to figure it out. And I think some folks approached Joe and asked him to try to end the fight. And I think part of what I said earlier is he felt a bit of an obligation. It was easier, I think, talking Joe Andrew out of the governor's race than it was talking Vi out. It took a little bit longer to do that. And I think the Indianapolis Star, did a story probably about a month ago now,
right,
about that. And Vi had some very interesting comments about that time. She probably would be a great guest for you to talk to as well, particularly about that particular time in history. It took a couple of conversations for sure. I don't have a particular memory of us going, this has got to be something you do, since he'd already decided he wasn't going to do it.
Right.
And I think it was just a bit of an evolution in his thinking as to what the best thing was.
Jim, we have just a few more minutes left, about 5 or 10 minutes. But Jim, your recollections of the 2004 campaign, it was a real clash of titans after, 92 was a bye washout. 2000, O'Bannon wins easily. 96 is relatively close. But so now you're set up for, Lakers Celtics. And what was it like to cover that? And was the election in your mind in doubt until the very end?
No, I don't think it was. To tell the truth, Mitch Daniels ran a textbook campaign, and this is maybe not the time or place, but I think the Kernan campaign, if they had it to do over again, they would have done it differently. I think there's been a lot said about how the public didn't really get to know Joe Kernan during that campaign. He clearly they felt like they were behind, and they ran a negative campaign aimed at Mitch Daniels, and we didn't get any warm and fuzzy ads until the last couple of weeks. So
I think your memory is a little faulty on that. The first ad we did was an introductory ad about him being a Vietnam veteran, POW, and he had some of his one of the guys who was prisoner of war with him talk. Those were some of the first ads. So we did do warm and fuzzy to begin with. But I think your central point is right. But that's probably a discussion for another time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, if you're looking at strategies, that's a great campaign to look at from both sides. If you're looking at, whether or not that was a difficult choice for the voters, I think those were two quality candidates, and the public would have been served no matter who won.
Jim, was Governor Kernan tough to cover, tough to criticize, given his personality and almost incomparable personal history? Like, when you run up against this sort of thing, and I think I may have asked this to you when you came on the podcast, are you just a professional doing a job, or do you look at Joe Kernan and you're like, man, it's going to be tough for me to stick it to him, because what a great guy, and Lord knows he served his country?
Well, and he had a demeanor that was no nonsense. I mean, I think if you went to Joe Kernan with a question, you better have a point to it and know what you're doing. But I got along great with him. I mean, he's, there's a Facebook page that's been created now, Memories of Joe Kernan, and most of them are about how kind and how funny he was, and there was always an element of that, and I enjoyed covering it.
Tina, what would you say would be Joe Kernan's strongest accomplishments as governor?
As governor, it felt like a whirlwind, because we tried to accomplish a lot in the short time before he became governor. Pushing for full-day kindergarten, trying to make higher ed more accessible, more affordable, expanding community college to more people across the state. He had things like I'm going to get the name wrong, but he had a program to encourage people through the state, a Buy Indiana program to drive more dollars into Indiana companies. Those are just some of the things off the top of my head. I mean, it was a whirlwind. It felt like we were announcing initiatives every day. I mean, Kathy and Joe worked on a peak performance project, which was to help streamline government, keep costs lower. He really tried to accomplish a lot in that short time. And again, it was what he enjoyed. It was being governor versus running for governor.
2004, Mitch Daniels defeats Joe Kernan. Just a few years later, Joe Kernan comes back to be co-chair of the Kernan-Shepard Commission to look at government reform, government restructuring. What does that say? And I'll ask you, Tina, what does that say about Joe Kernan, that he would be willing to do that?
Well, it says two things. One, of course, he is willing to work with anyone to make the state of Indiana better. I will say, though, it had a lot to do with Chief Justice Randy Shepard. He really admired him. So I think that was definitely a lure. But I just think he's willing to do anything to achieve something that makes people's lives in Indiana better.
Jim, what was it like when, because I think I was the comms director at the Republican Party when that was announced. What was it like when Joe Kernan comes back in the State House or the governor's office? I forget exactly where the introductory press conference was. And there he is. Was it fun to see him again? And do you remember if he said anything to you?
I don't have any specific memories from that, but of course it was, a big surprise. This, like I said, that was a hard fought race. And there was every reason to believe that Mitch Daniels and Joe Kernan had hard feelings toward one another. And the fact that Mitch Daniels would turn to Joe Kernan for help, and the fact that Joe Kernan would accept, I thought was an amazing development. Although I will say, despite the hard fought nature of the 2004 race, you could tell that Mitch Daniels had admiration for Joe Kernan. He several times referred to him as my governor. And he knew that the public held Joe Kernan in high esteem, and that even though they were tough on the issues, this was a guy who he had to show respect for.
Kip, do you want to weigh in real quick before we wrap up here in a few minutes?
I don't want this. I'll tell you personally, I suggested Joe not do it. I thought he was being used, and he didn't take my advice, of course, because he's a better man than I, and he was trying to do what was best for the state of Indiana. To me, it was an indication by Mitch Daniels that the person that he had vanquished was every bit as capable as he was, and I should have looked at it that way myself when I heard it, but instead I took the most cynical view of it, which is not my nature.
Laura Beck, did you hear that? Ed Tracy, Phil Miller, weigh in, please.
It's just another indication of the strength of Joe Kernan's character, that despite some of his friends telling him don't get in that thicket, because the other thing I told him is all you're going to do in this thing is make enemies, because you're going to be telling people that they shouldn't have a job anymore. But he took it anyway because he thought it was in the best interest of the state. It was a way to show that people who had tough fights can still come together and try to do something for the good of the state. It was totally in character with Joe Kernan and his life story to have done it. And even if Mitch Daniels' only reason to do it was cynical, it was still a brilliant political move on Mitch Daniels' part.
We usually end the podcast with 5 questions, but that's not necessarily appropriate today. So I'm going to ask 2 or 3 quick questions, and just to get very quick answers, maybe one word if you can do it, and then we'll wind up. Tina Noel, what made Joe Kernan mad?
Does this have to be one word?
No, not necessarily for this question, or any of them. You could say reporters.
No.
You could say USC.
Please don't think I'm making this up. When I was out walking this morning, picking up trash, because it's something Joe recommended or didn't. No, that's not recommended. He led by example. That was the big thing for Joe. It's not, he said, you should pick up trash. He did it, so you wanted to do it. But I was trying to think, he just didn't ever get angry at people. You knew if you did something wrong. I just couldn't. I am not making up that I can't think what made him mad.
I can.
I'm going to have to pass. Okay. See, how about a Notre Dame loss? And I'll tell how about Notre Dame loss is one word. However, I'm going to tell a funny story tied to it that I think I alluded to somewhere, but we would get a Christmas tree donated every year, the lieutenant governor's office, because he was the head of agriculture, one of the ag related industries. It's awful that I can't remember which one. They would bring a Christmas tree, donated one to our office every year. And on there would be some Notre Dame ornaments. And then we had a former football player from the University of Alabama was on our staff. And there'd be a Notre Dame ornament and an Alabama ornament. And somehow the Alabama ornament would be broken. And nobody would claim who did that, but we all knew who broke the Alabama ornament. So I'm just going to go with Notre Dame lost because for being mad, because I can't picture it.
Kip, what made Joe Kernan laugh?
Oh, I thought I was going to answer that question. Oh my God, so many things made Joe Kernan laugh. He had the greatest sense of humor of anybody I've ever met. I will tell you what made him mad: slow and indecisive drivers. Definitely made him.
You're right.
Definitely made him mad.
Right.
He got really mad at me one time, but you don't have time for that story. It involved the gubernatorial debate. I'll tell the story some other time. He was very mad at me.
Can we just do a whole podcast on things that people get mad at Kip Tew about?
Other than his cynicism. Other than
he could laugh at just about it. He could make a joke about anything. He did make gentle fun of people. Very few, I think, very, very few people that he made fun of got upset by it. He knew how to make fun of you, and you just had to laugh about it. It's too hard to describe his sense of humor other than it was wonderful.
Let me pick up right there, because the one lasting memory that a lot of people have of Joe Kernan is when he showed up at a press club gridiron dinner in a yellow tuxedo that I think maybe he wore at the prom or some such thing. It was something that apparently came out of his closet, but it was 3 sizes too small. And when he got up to the rostrum to make a presentation, one of the people he made fun of was the former Attorney General Jeff Modisette, who, Joe Kernan was bald. Jeff Modisette had this huge comb over, and he made a crack about Modisette's comb over, and he said what he needed to do was get a haircut like his, and he took a pitcher of water and he poured it over his head and said, "See, I can do this."
I am going to end the podcast with our podcast about Joe Kernan with my one and only Joe Kernan story, which I know at least 2 of you have probably heard before, but it's very special to me. And it takes place in a bar, and that is the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. It has trivia there last Friday of every month. And in 2007, I received a phone call from the absolutely amazing and wonderful Casey Kendrick, who used to work for Governor Kernan. And she said the governor and Maggie will be at trivia tonight, and she was going with some friends. And I said, "Oh, that's terrific. I need to make sure I say something." I get there. It's a relatively big crowd for the Golden Ace. There's probably 40, 50 people there. But I get there very early, and the governor and Maggie and Casey and Kevin Murray, who we all know, and the Larimores were there. And I'm not in the Ace more than 10 seconds. And, I start getting lit up pretty hard about being a Republican. And I just left the Republican Party to go work for Shield Sexton. And it's all in fun, and it's all a good time. And we're all joking and laughing. And it's the first time I'd ever shaken Joe Kernan's hand. And I said, Governor, I said, I think there may be a way that I can change your opinion about me. And he had flashed kind of a smile and goes, "It's going to take a lot." This is a man I've known all of 3 minutes. And I took off the POW bracelet that I had for several years that I had worn. Even when I used to go on TV representing the Republican Party, I wore a Joe Kernan POW bracelet. And my boss at the time, Murray Clark, never once told me I couldn't wear it. And I took it off and I gave it to him. And the look on his face, I'll never forget. It was one of deep humility. And the look on Maggie Kernan's face, whom I had never met, was probably more shock and awe than anything else. She was very touched by it, as she told me. The other people at the table had no idea that I had this bracelet either. And I managed to get the last word. And Governor Kernan wore his POW bracelet for the entire evening. And, and at the end of trivia, about 2 or 3 hours later, he came up, he put his arm around me, and he said, This means a lot, Robert. Thank you. And we can't say enough about Joe Kernan and his career and his service and his sacrifice. And that just short story, just those few minutes that I stood talking to him, is something that I will never forget. You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmond Construction, the Crown Plaza Hotel, Grand Hall, and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the law firm of Bose, McKinney, and Evans, and the Bose Public Affairs Group, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guests today have been Tina Noel, Kip Tew, and Jim Shella, and we have discussed the life, legacy, career, impact, and warmth of Governor Joe Kernan. Thank you both. Thank you all very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Robert, for shining the spotlight on a wonderful person.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.